Hello everyone, I'm Moin Syed from the University of Minnesota. I'm very pleased to be kicking off this symposium today, and big thanks to Neil for the invitation. As you can see from the title of my talk, I'm not going to be particularly positive towards social psychology today. I hope that you will take my critical comments in the spirit that they were intended rather than reacting defensively to them. The intention is that we can hopefully make things better, which we all need to do in a number of domains, but in particular today what I'm focusing on is the area of diversity. Of course, thinking about improving diversity within the field is quite complex and can't be boiled down to a singular factor, but because I only have 10 minutes today, I'm going to pretend like we can, and that is experiments. Now, the social psychology's focus on experiments has been critiqued quite a bit in the literature, but mostly in terms of issues of external validity, the degree to which the lab-based experiments can generalize to the, quote, real world. I'm taking a somewhat different angle here and making two very general points. One is that the emphasis on experiments in the field restricts diversity within social psychology, and that the emphasis on experiments is scientifically unjustifiable. So we're engaging in a practice that is both harmful to the makeup of the field, but also harmful to the science as a whole. Now, it's important in making these points to know a little bit of history about the experimental focus of social psychology. Not long ago, there wasn't so much a difference between social psychology and sociology, but social psychologists became increasingly interested in conducting lab-based experiments. And as they did, conducting experiments focusing more on the micro context of behavior, that became the emphasis within the field, whereas sociology focused more on the structural, broader social macro context factors. Now, hopefully you have your causal inference brain on and you're wondering if the direction of causation goes somewhat differently and is more substantive, that social psychologists became interested in the immediate micro context, which then lent itself to conducting lab-based experiments and then went from there. That is totally plausible and makes a lot of sense, but is also fairly inconsistent with the historical record. Rather, it seems that there was a real keen interest in conducting lab-based experiments, which then led to the focus on the micro context because that's what can be studied more easily in a lab context versus the structural factors. Now, why would this interest arise? Why this intense focus on experiments? Well, it's likely because of our old friend physics envy. At that time, around World War II and now, social psychologists and psychologists in general were a little self-conscious about their status within the field, wanting to be taken seriously as a real science. Right? And so they looked to those who are considered real sciences, the natural sciences, and their heavy focus on experimentation. And so if social psychologists could emulate this approach, that might increase their status and the perception amongst other scientists and the public at large that they are engaging in real science. However, it's quite clear that if the way you approach any psychological question is thinking, how do I fit it into an experiment? And even more narrowly, perhaps, how do I fit it in a 2x2 experiment? It's just a fact that you're necessarily restricting yourself from the broader universe of possible and interesting questions, social, psychological, and otherwise, that you could pursue. And in particular, these are the kinds of questions that might be especially of interest to minority researchers who are getting into the field. One of my mentors, Dr. Linda Zhuang, she got into psychology because she was interested in understanding more about why she was engaging in conflict with her immigrant parents when she was an adolescent. That is not the kind of topic that lends itself to so much to a lab-based experiment. And accordingly, she went instead to developmental psychology, where those kinds of questions can be pursued. And what we see now is there's really a thriving diversity science within developmental psychology, focusing on topics of identity, acculturation, discrimination, socialization, schooling, all that were really driven heavily by minority scholars, informed by their personal experiences, but then turned into rigorous forms of scientific inquiry. So this real heavy focus on experimentation might be pushing away some of the very students that the field is hoping to attract. Now, you may say to yourself, of course, social psychology studies topics of racism, discrimination, prejudice, all kinds of topics that minority researchers would be interested in. And that is true. However, when they do, they overwhelmingly study them from what's often referred to as the perpetrator's perspective, from the white perspective. So even when studying diversity-related topics in social psychology, the perspective of the majority is being privileged. And interestingly, according to the data from Roberts et al., that perspective is true whether the researchers themselves are white or researchers of color, suggesting that it's a field-wide kind of focus, a framework of how social psychology of diversity is carried out. Now, why would this be the case? Of course, it's important to examine perpetrators and all actors and those who are involved within the field of diversity, but why such an intense focus on white participants? Well, yes, I believe it's experiments. Most of these studies are lab-based experiments conducted in university settings, and so they require participants, subjects who are nearby, and nearby tends to be college students. There's a reason why Arnett suggested that JPSB be renamed the Journal of the Personality and Social Psychology of American Undergraduate Introductory Psychology Students. Now, it is the case that universities are much more diverse than we often give credit for, but there's still a relatively small pool to draw from if you're only focusing on lab-based experiments. So in all, it seems quite clear to me that the methods are driving the substantive focus of the field, both in terms of how the questions are asked, fitting it into the experiments, and then the specific nature of the design, focusing on the perpetrator or the majority view, all to sort of fit the project, the study, into an experimental paradigm, rather than driving with a substantive question that then leads to a particular method. But experiments, you say, experiments, this is the bread and butter of science, right? Causal relations. What's more scientific than that? And I'll tell you what's more scientific than that. Asking good questions and designing studies that address those questions in the best way possible, right? Rather than having a method first leading to a question, you have a question leading to a method. We can broadly think of the steps in science as consisting of observation, description, explanation, prediction, and control. That each of these steps really relies on the previous, and you build upon each other to get more in-depth knowledge about a particular topic and in a particular field. Social psychology is heavily rooted at the explanation phase, focusing on testing hypotheses, developing theories, trying to establish causal relations among constructs. This is where the vast majority of attention is paid. But this is highly problematic because almost no attention is paid to the observation and description phases. So what's happening then is the attempt to try to understand causal relations amongst constructs that we simply do not understand. And that's not going to end well, and we're seeing that that's not ending well. So what we see is the focus on experimentation really provides kind of a smokescreen that hides some other more problematic practices. Yes, you're conducting a rigorous science-based experiment, but having only 10 white participants per cell is not really getting the job done. So what this looks like to me is more about playing science, sort of appealing to what science is supposed to look like. Again, going back to that history of trying to raise the status by having a strong focus on experimentation, playing science rather than doing science, of asking good questions and having carefully designed studies, no matter what method that might be. And the influence of physics envy just continues to really infiltrate all ways of thinking, not just in social psychology, in all areas of psychology, but especially in the experimental focus of social psychology. So at this point, I asked the question, what is the risk to diversifying methods? Why not? Where has this strong focus on experimental methods really gotten us? Thinking about all the issues that are brought up in yesterday's symposium and that will be discussed in today's, and over the last decade in the wake of the replication crisis and the open science movement, the strong focus on experimental methods has not brought the accumulated knowledge that we all hoped it would. So why not try something else? Why not be more open to conducting qualitative and mixed method studies, to generating more rigorous, deeper knowledge about the topics that we're also passionate about studying? And the only answer that I can come up with for why not is status. the focus on hierarchy, the idea that experiments and conducting experiments accrues or confers some kind of status marker that indicates that we're doing real science. And that in itself is not doing real science. The focus on experiments is not good for science. It's not good for diversity. We really need to be thinking about how we can expand our toolbox and focus on questions and tailoring designs to those questions. I'll close by mentioning that when I first heard about SPSP, I was told that the P for personality is silent. I find the dynamic between social and personality to be odd and quite troubling, actually. It's this explicit hierarchy in the field that nobody is really ashamed of verbalizing out loud. It's just out there in the open. And indeed, social psychology has a hierarchy problem. All areas of psychology and science do, but social psychology in particular does, focusing on rising stars and superstars, celebrity encounters at conferences, overemphasizing one overrated journal as being the premier outlet where all the important science is being published. Again, none of this is good for science, and none of this is good for diversity. So as the society and the field is thinking about how to engage in different initiatives to improve diversity in the field, one of the important targets needs to be this hierarchical nature and try to de-emphasize the status-based approach to science. And one way to do that is downplaying the role of experiments. Experiments are important. We should be doing experiments, but bring down their role in the hierarchy. Thank you very much. Comments, questions, complaints, rotten tomatoes, whatever you want, you can send. Thanks for listening.